Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and I'd like to introduce you to the book of Proverbs. Wisdom literature, and the book of Proverbs is a part of wisdom literature. This was an ancient form of literature, not unique to the Bible. We actually had wisdom literature that predated the writing of any of the Bible. It was found all across the Middle East, and it deals with the way the world works. Let's look at some examples. I'd like to introduce you to the maxims of good discourse. Notice this is written around 2400 BC. This is long before Abraham. And it goes, if the Son of Man, and notice that's just a way to describe a person. You're going to see that phrase used later on in the book of Ezekiel in much the same way. If the Son of Man accepts his Father's words, no plan of his will go wrong. Teach your son, therefore, to be a healer, one who will be valued by the heart of the nobles, one who guides his mouth by what he was told, one who regarded one regarded as a listener. This son excels. His deeds stand out, while failure enters him who listens not. Notice the value of listening. The knower wakes early to his lasting form, while the fool is hard pressed. Continues. The fool who does not listen can accomplish nothing at all. He sees knowledge as ignorance, uselessness, and harmfulness. He does all that is detestable and is blamed for it each day. He lives on that by which one dies. He feeds on, excuse the term, they mean that literally. I think he feeds on damned speech. Finally, his sword is known to the officials, to wit, a living death each day. One passes over his doings because of his many daily troubles. So that's an ancient proverb on how one ought to live, and of course, notice the emphasis there on living before the officials, the people in charge. That will make things go better, and that's the idea here. While proverbs are not unique to the Bible, the proverbs of the Bible, I think, are unique when you compare them to other proverbs throughout the ancient world. First of all, and most obviously, the proverbs of the Bible are monotheistic in their tone. Right from when we get to verse 7, we're going to be talking about the Lord, Yahweh, and we'll see that in just a few minutes. But they are decidedly monotheistic as opposed to the proverbs of antiquity, which were polytheistic. Another thing that we see is the importance of human life versus land values in the ancient world. Land and money and wealth and materialism, that was a big thing, as opposed to human life, which wasn't considered that valuable. The Bible puts a very different emphasis. And that tells me something, that even though um, I see wisdom literature in antiquity, that it is can I call it a fallen wisdom, where man was originally created in the image of God, but affected by the fall. And that went for his proverbs as well. So we're going to brush away those fallen elements. As we come to the book of Proverbs, we're going to see wisdom from the word, wisdom from the Lord. Now, our world of life view then begins with God, where in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and our view of life comes from that, and our way of life, therefore, should come from our view of life. That is, that God gave the law to Moses, and from that, remember, you have the prophets and wisdom literature that come to us, and they reflect the very mind of God. Now, as we're looking at the book of Proverbs as part of a greater collection known as the poetical books, we have Psalms and Proverbs, of course, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. And those are all books of poetry, but several of those, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes in particular, are described as wisdom literature. There's a few wisdom psalms, but for the most part, Psalms and Song of Songs are not classified as wisdom literature. But Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are. Now, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to jump right in. Notice how it begins. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Largely, we're going to see Solomon as the author of a great deal of these Proverbs, especially this first section. That term proverb, mishli is the Hebrew word. Mashal is the root word to rule. So we could call this the rules of living, and that works nicely. The rules by which you can govern your life. And then he continues to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding. So notice wisdom, and that's a key word here. Chokhmah is the word for wisdom. Delightful term there. Exodus chapter 28, verse 3 uses that same word for wisdom, but notice how it renders it. You shall speak to all the skillful persons who I have endowed with the spirit of wisdom. So these people that were skillful, they were the ones who had a spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him. This back when God was giving the instructions on building the tabernacle, and also constructing the garments that Aaron was going to wear very carefully. That he may minister as a priest to me. And that involved a certain amount of skill. And the term there, for all those that were skillful persons who had a spirit of wisdom, the term there is chokhmah, which tells me something about wisdom. Wisdom involves a skill. Now, some skills can come to people sort of naturally. Some people are better at certain things than others, just natural. But skills also have to be developed. And wisdom is like that. It's the skill of living, and it has to be developed as well. So to know wisdom and instructions, to discern the sayings of understanding. Now, literally, and our translation is a good one, but I want you to see that that word understanding is actually used twice. If we want to be literal, this doesn't sound like very good English, but it's good Hebrew. To understand the sayings of understanding. Notice how understanding in that second line is used twice. However, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern or to understand the saying of understanding. Notice how there's two different terms there. To know, yada, in line one, and then to discern, to understand. And what we have here in Hebrew poetry is what's called synonymous parallelism. We're going to see three types of parallelism. This is one of them. Synonymous, when the word synonymous just means that it's the same. And so what you do is you say a truth in the first line, and then you say the same thing, but with different words. So and by the way, that's helpful. If you don't understand one of the lines, then look at the other one. It's going to explain it. So to know wisdom and instruction, what does that mean? It means understand the sayings of understanding. And so you say it with different terms, but in the second line. Next, we go to verse 3, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. Now, this time, you have what we call synthetic parallelism. In a synthesis, that's bringing it all together. What you do is you say the truth in the first line, and then you finish the thought, because it's not really completed. You finish it in the second line. So, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. Now, verse 4, to give prudence to the naive. Now, that's just the opposite of being wisdom. And to the youth, notice the naivety and youth, that's describing the same thing. So this is back to our synonymous parallelism. What does it mean to be naive? Very often it means to act like you're young. You haven't learned yet. They don't have to go together. You can have, somebody said there's no fool like an old fool. I guess you can have naivety with somebody that's older, but usually you develop a little bit of sense along the way, even if maybe not a lot of wisdom. You at least get some experience. And so this is telling me that Proverbs are for the young. Verse 5, a wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. Notice that this is going to happen over time. So you have a wise man and a man of understanding. So notice that Proverbs, yes, they are for the young, but they're also for the old as well. There's no age limit to wisdom. Hopefully, as you grow in experience, as you grow in both years, but hopefully it's not just the same experience again and again and again, but that you are learning from it, that you are growing as wisdom as well. And then verse 6, to understand a proverb, and notice how you've got a few different ways of describing what this proverb is, and that word proverb, mashal again, but a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and they're riddles. Now, this is telling me something. This is all descriptive of what Proverbs are. Some of the Proverbs are going to be easy to understand. We'll just see it and you say, okay, I get that. That's pretty easy. Sometimes a little bit profound, sometimes just saying it, sometimes saying a simple, easy to understand thing, but in a certain way can make it profound. But sometimes the Proverbs will contain riddles. That is, sometimes they will not be easy to understand, and we'll come to a proverb, we'll look at it, and we'll ponder over the meaning. And sometimes that will happen in the Proverbs. Now, finally, we come to verse 7. This is as far as we're going to go in this lecture, but we've got a ways to go. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now, notice that word Lord. It's in all capital letters, and we've seen this in other when we've done studies of other books of the Old Testament. Whenever you see the word Lord in all capital letters, in most translations, I'm using the New American Standard here. Um, that's the translator's way of telling you this is the name of God. And you say, well, I can't read Hebrew, so I don't know what that is. Yahweh. And notice what I put here is the term without vowel points. Vowel points are these little dots and dashes that come usually underneath or sometimes over, but usually underneath a letter, Hebrew letter. They didn't use vowels. They didn't write vowels. I should start to say they didn't use vowels. That's not true. They had vowels. They just didn't write them down. They didn't need to. But we do. And so I'm going to take, when you see me give the Hebrew, I'm usually going to do it vowel points and all. I need all the help I can get. And so this is the name of God. It's the covenant name of God. Now, I just said that Proverbs don't have a lot about the covenant in there, but they do have the covenant name of God. So it's not just any God. It's talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But notice the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I think this is a key to the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And then you say it in its opposite sense, fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, that term fear, yara, or yira, it's the basic Hebrew word for fear. It doesn't have any kind of deeper meaning. It's, when you're afraid of something. But when you're afraid of something, that fear can take a couple of different responses. This is not a fear that drives away. It's not like, monsters are coming and you go and you hide from them. No, that's not what the fear of the Lord is. Instead, and my favorite illustration to describe the fear of the Lord is that time when Jesus was in the boat with his disciples. Remember, the storm had whipped up and Jesus was asleep in the boat, and the disciples saw the wind and the waves, and frankly, they were afraid. They would have liked to have been out of there. It wasn't driving them off the boat, but they really would have preferred to be off the boat and back on safely on land. And so they wake up Jesus, and Jesus looks at them, and then he looks at the wind and the waves, and he tells the wind and the waves, "Be quiet!" And it gets quiet. And then we read, and then they were very afraid. Now, that doesn't mean they wanted to jump out of the boat now and get to land, but rather this was a fear that brings awe and respect. Not a paralyzing fear, but a fear that says, I need to take this seriously. And let me just say, in my background, I spent many years as a firefighter, and one of the things that at the beginning of my career, I was a little bit afraid of heights. Probably still am, just a bit. Let me just say it this way: I have a healthy respect of heights. And you say, well, wait a second, John, you have literally slid down ropes, walked off the top of a 25-story building. You have taught rope rappelling, and you've done rock climbing, 70 feet up, just hanging on with your fingertips. That's true, but that hasn't done away with the fear. It's not a paralyzing fear. It brings awe and respect. And if you haven't stood in the presence of God and felt a bit of that awe, respect, can I say fear, then you really haven't stood in the presence of God. Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now, it's not the end of it. That's not all there is to it. We're going to see a lot more things, but it all begins and centers there. And so there is a difference. Notice how this is antithetical parallelism between the one who fears God versus the fool who just ignores God or isn't afraid and doesn't treat God with any respect. There's a big contrast to be seen here. And so, yes, this is antithetical parallelism. Now, finally, as we close, I want to talk a bit about the nature of wisdom literature. It stands apart from God's covenants in the sense that we're not really going to talk about God's covenants and things like that. That's not going to be the theme here. There's no mention going to be made of Moses or Israel or things like that. Um, the nature of its inspired message is primarily using things like observation of nature instead of thus saith the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean it's not from God, doesn't mean it's not true, but the way that the truth is expressed is going to come very oftentimes. And one classical example is seen in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, that starts off at many different times in many different ways. God spoke to the fathers by the prophets. He spoke to Moses through theophanies. He spoke to the prophets through spiritual communications. And as we come to the sages, like the book of Proverbs, we're going to see insightful observations that are made. An example of this, and we'll get to this, is so spoiler alert, Proverbs chapter 24, about 24 lessons from now, we'll get there. Proverbs 24, verses 30 and 31. I passed by the field of the sluggard. The sluggard is another term for a lazy person. And by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. Not notice how you say it, and then you say it with different words. So field and vineyard are the same thing. The sluggard and the man lacking sense, that's the same person. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles, that is his vineyard. Its surface was covered with nettles, its stone wall was broken down. Continue, when I saw, I reflected upon it, I looked and received instruction. And here's the proverb, and this proverb is probably quoted from a secular proverb that was just in the Middle East. And here's the secular proverb: a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. It's a cute little proverb. But notice he comes to the proverb having seen it played out in the field of the lazy person, sort of who let his field go, and it was just like people had broken in and stolen, except that he was stealing from himself, really. Now, here's our outline of the book of Proverbs, sort of, presenting in full, chapters 1 through 9. We're going to spend the next 9 sessions here in the appeal to wisdom. And then starting in chapter 10, verse 1, we'll start off. These are the Proverbs of Solomon. So chapters 1 through 9, I think, are given from Solomon as well. But now we're going to get into these largely one-verse maxims. That doesn't mean they are standalone necessarily, but each one does, express a unique truth. But then they'll be often, in fact, regularly sort of chained together into a common theme. And so Proverbs of Solomon go from chapter 10 all the way to chapter 24. Chapter 25, verse 1 will start off, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, which were collected by the men of Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah lived hundreds of years later. So that's telling me the Proverbs were not put into their present form by Solomon, because some of them were collected at a much later date. And that's the whole central section from chapter 10 to chapter 29. That's the whole central section of the book. And then the last 2 chapters, chapter 30, are the words of Agur, and these are larger couplets, and they'll be a very distinctive style. As soon as you see them, you'll say, well, that's very different from what we've seen up to this point. And then chapter 31 will be the words of King Lemuel. And it will start by giving some instructions to him. And then the last 22 verses, from verse 10 all the way down to the end, will be the description of the good woman, or what I call the valiant woman. So you begin with who we're going to see her as Lady Wisdom in chapters 1 through 9, and then finally the valiant woman at the end of the book, sort of bookends for this wonderful book. Now, let me just say, Proverbs are about probabilities. So we're told, walk in wisdom, and life will tend to go well. Now, can there be exceptions to the rule? Yes, there can. Think about the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. Give some exceptions. But you walk in foolishness, and life will tend not to go well. That's the generality. So it's speaking in those sorts of generalities. And it is about probability. So Proverbs focuses on the general rule. Books like Job and Ecclesiastes, they focus on the exceptions. If you want to read about those, we'll have separate studies on those. But right now, we're just going to focus on the general truths on the book of Proverbs. Finally, let me just say that Proverbs holds truths in tension. We do this in some of our English proverbs as well. We say, for example, that the pen is mightier than the sword. And that reflects a truth, but that doesn't reflect all truth. Because we say correspondingly that actions speak louder than words. You say, well, which one is true? Is the pen mightier than the sword? Are actions louder than words? It depends on the situation. Each one expresses the truth, and we hold these truths in tension, and we'll do the same thing with the book of Proverbs. So next time we'll finish up in chapter 1. So we'll start in chapter 1, verse 8, as we enter the section of the appeal to wisdom, and we're going to see 10 speeches that will take us through the rest of chapter 1 and all the way to chapter 9. But we'll pick that thread up next time.